Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund. And I want to thank you for joining us for our Under the Redwoods webinar series, in which we explore the beauty, the history, the science, the inspiration, the artistry, the benefits of redwood forests. I especially want to thank Sharp Investments. They've been our sponsor for the Under the Redwoods webinar series this year, and we are grateful for their support. Today's webinar is going to be a little bit different. We're going to have a guest expert come and speak, but she's going to be speaking about a new program that Semper Virens is launching. I'll tell you a bit about that before I invite her to join us. But just as a reminder, Semper Virens' history is a long one. Over 100 years ago, we began advocating for forest protection, specifically redwood protection. And from the very earliest days of our advocacy, we've always had, as an organization, a dual mission of both preserving these forests and advocating for them to be accessible for the enjoyment of all. And that's reflected in our very long history of partnering and, in fact, being instrumental in the creation of California state parks, the state agency and the state park system that allow people from around the world, and certainly people from all over California, to experience California's natural treasures. So that's always been, that kind of access and enjoyment has always been a part of our organization's mission. And in recent years, we have really come to understand more and more that it's not just a nice to have to be able to experience these forests and enjoy them, but that there really are very direct health benefits to be gained from spending time in nature, and in particular from spending time in redwood forests. Through that interest and understanding, we've gotten to know today's guest, Suzanne Bartlett Hackenmiller, very well. She's a medical doctor. We often have on these webinar series PhD doctors, but she is a medical doctor, and she is so much more. She's become a real advocate for people to spend time in nature and to help them understand how and why that is beneficial to their health and their physical and mental well-being. And she is a practitioner of forest bathing. You can find one of our earliest webinars we did with her, in which she talked about the benefits of forest bathing. She's a wellness advisor to All Trails, and most recently, she's become Semper Virens' wellness advisor, our first ever. And it just shows that we are really taking seriously the opportunity to help people understand how time in forests can benefit them and their health. So with her guidance and expertise and support, we are launching a new program. It's called the Trails Prescription Program for the Santa Cruz Mountains. Here's some of the information you can eventually find on our website. This program will officially launch on Thursday, so you're getting a sneak preview. I want to share a little bit more about the program before Suzanne joins us. What is Trails RX? It is a curated online guide for you to explore trails in the Santa Cruz Mountains that will boost your health. Trails RX is intended to give people, patients, clinicians, folks working in public health, more options for how to help turn a recommendation for time in nature, just sort of a general get outdoors advice that you might get from your doctor, into something specific, into specific suggestions for where you might go outdoors and benefit from a specific place or a specific trail. The trails featured in Trails RX are intended to both introduce you to a new park destination. All of the trails that we're profiling in Trails RX are within California state parks. And it's meant to introduce you to a new park or a new trail and connect you with easy rated trails that can allow you to explore nature in ways that support your health and your wellness journey. So what are the trails specifically that are featured? We started with some easy rated trails to really make this something that everybody could find accessible. And they are located in Año Nuevo, Big Basin, Butno, Castle Rock, and Henry Cowell State Parks. These are state parks that are core to Semper Virens' history areas where we've worked for generations to protect land and forests, and now we're really trying to encourage people to take full advantage of those amazing resources. The guide to each trail in Trails RX includes basic information about the trail, what you might find in any sort of trail guide. But what's distinct is it includes not only information about how long the trail is, how steep it is, how you get there, but it also provides an advanced overview of the physical and accessibility features of the trail, health data about the direct benefits of spending time on that particular trail, and some advanced invitations, if you will, and I think Suzanne will talk about this a bit in her talks, or prompts for visitors to really enjoy the trail more fully through the use of all of their senses, to really take the time to stop during their hike and fully absorb with all five senses the natural features that you're experiencing. So with that, I'm really delighted today to introduce you to the Trails RX program. Thank you for joining me today, and to invite Dr. Suzanne Bartlett Hackenmiller to join us in speaking about this program and some of her past history and experience in doing similar programs elsewhere, and explain a bit about the why. Why did we develop such a program? So with that, I invite Suzanne on with us, and look forward to her remarks. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This is so exciting. I can hardly believe this is coming to fruition. So I will share my screen here and we'll get going. Everyone see that? Sorry about that. All right. So prescribing nature, as Sarah said, we're going to talk about the why today. And many of you may have heard about the parks prescription programs. And these are programs that started to evolve in around the early 2010s, 2013 to be exact. Both Park RX in California and Park RX America started out in Washington, D.C. And these were born out of the idea that, gosh, people need to get outside. And Park RX America was started by my friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Czar, who's a pediatrician. And I think he started to recognize that the children he was seeing were increasingly experiencing some of the chronic health conditions that adults are dealing with in the United States. And he was also seeing that they were dealing with mental health conditions. And he wondered if, gosh, if we could just get these kids outside to play more, perhaps that would be beneficial. Maybe if we could get them off of their screens and just get them outdoors with good old-fashioned play, that would be good for them. So he, and also with Park RX, wanted to make it more specific than just saying, you know what, why don't you get outside a little bit more? And so they wanted to really create a prescription, as we would for any medication, that would be taken as seriously as any medication that someone would pick up at their local pharmacy. So a prescription might look like this, with the patient's name and then a location where they would really even look at a map and find a park that was close to the patient's home, and then suggest something specific that they would invite them to do during that time there, and then give them a frequency, just like we would give a frequency for how often you should take a medication, and then how long, duration of time that you would spend. So really making it a serious prescription. And so here's another kind of example of what these, and I've done this with my patients, literally handed them a paper prescription with specifics on how to get out and enjoy nature. So you may have heard that internationally this is becoming a thing. This is not great resolution in this photo, but a few years back, doctors in Canada started prescribing nature, and they can even give a pass for a national park that a patient can then use. So this is becoming an international trend. In Scotland, they're prescribing nature as well. Doctors can offer patients a year-long calendar that has specific recommendations for ways to interact in nature on any given day of the year. Excuse me. As Sarah mentioned, I was involved in a program that we started in Iowa a couple years ago at Hartman Reserve Nature Center. And if you're interested, you can go to their website and learn more. And this is a picture of myself demonstrating this. And we took 5 trails. We decided to kind of expand on the Park RX plan and add it, kind of take it one step further to trail prescriptions. So we took 5 trails at this nature center, and we decided to develop a physical prescription, a physical health prescription, and also a mental health prescription for each of the 5 trails. So for each trail, I took the distance of the trail and the elevation change, and with a good old calculator, calculated the calories burned and or something called the metabolic equivalent of task, which basically is how much energy you expend by doing something. And so one MET or MET would be just sitting doing kind of like we are right now, all the way up to much higher numbers of METs for, say, running or jogging or playing pickleball or something like that. And so I calculated, given the distance, duration of the trail, and the elevation change, these different health parameters that a person of different weights. So you could type in your weight and you could type in your pace, whether you were walking, jogging, or running on the trail, and it would tell you how much energy was expended. And this MET concept is something that increasingly I think doctors are going to be using and discussing with their patients. So then we also created a mental health prescription for each of these trails where we would find a landmark on the trail where a person could stop, sit on a bench. You can see in this photo, we have a QR code, and a person could use their phone to get the QR code, which would take them to a recording of a forest bathing invitation. And Sarah alluded to this, and I'll explain this more in just a moment. So really making it so that people could have an interactive experience that was healthful on each of these 5 different trails. So the why. Why would I prescribe nature, and why do I think other doctors should prescribe nature? So I'll give you a little refresher course here about health in the United States. This may not be a big surprise to many of you, but we're dealing a lot with chronic illness right now and stress as a cause and contributing factor for both mental and physical illness. And so if you look at this slide, this talks about a little bit about acute versus chronic disease. And 100 years ago, we were really preoccupied with acute illnesses, infections, bacteria, viruses, accidents. And these are the things that people would die from 100, 150 years ago. But with the onset of antibiotics and increasingly having surgical options, more people are surviving acute illnesses and injuries and living to develop chronic conditions. And so on the list on the right, you can see a number of chronic conditions you're probably familiar with. And interestingly enough, we're not as good in medicine at addressing chronic illness, even though you might think we are. But some people might be surprised to know that, for example, putting stents in the heart and the coronary arteries of the heart doesn't actually prolong life. It helps to prevent chest pain, but hasn't been shown to prolong life. So we'll talk a little bit more about kind of my approach to dealing with chronic illness in a moment here. But if you look at this list, this was from the CDC, looking at 2017 data before COVID, and the causes of death listed here by from top to bottom. Number 1 still is heart disease, then cancer of all types, followed by respiratory illnesses, accidents, stroke, Alzheimer's, etc. But if you look at this highlighted, all of the highlighted ones are chronic conditions, and the ones that are left unhighlighted are more of the acute illnesses. So you can see that chronic illness is a major concern. We also have real issues with the metabolic syndrome. So this syndrome encompasses type 2 diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, high I said, high cholesterol. And also stress is being factored in now to the metabolic syndrome. And this syndrome rose by about at least 5% in the short duration between 2011 and 2016, and it is probably significantly higher now. And we know now that mental stress affects really all of the systems in the body, everything from our heart, our lungs, our nervous system, the reproductive system, our GI tract, our hormones, endocrine system. So it's really a serious thing to consider, the way that mental stress and mental illness affects us physically. We actually know that $186 billion was spent on the treatment of mental illness in the year 2014, and I would bet that that number has continued to go up every year. Nearly 1 in 5 adults are living with a mental illness. So, oops, gonna go back to there for just a second. I practice integrative medicine, and so again, I think it's really important to think about this idea that if we're really dealing with chronic illness, it's getting to the root of the problem that is a better and more sustainable way to address things. So in integrative medicine, we look at such things as nutrition, exercise, management of stress, sleep, and also nature as a way to be more preventative, more holistic, as it were, in trying to get to the root of the problem as opposed to putting band-aids on symptoms. So this is where I think nature comes in. And if you look at this slide, I won't get all of the way into the weeds on this, but in the number 1 over there, nature exposure can look like all kinds of different things. It can be actually being out in nature. It can be looking at a photo of nature. It can be looking out your window, all kinds of things. And then we know increasingly from the research that there are active ingredients, things that we're still fleshing out through the science, that are the reasons why being in nature is beneficial. Things like the phytoncides, which I'll talk about more in a minute. In fact, I'll talk about a bunch of these different things, but things that are in nature that help us to feel better. And then it has these different effects on the body, these mechanisms that I won't get into in number 3 and 4. But then on number 5, it just talks about how just increasingly we're putting all these pieces of the puzzle together to figure out exactly how and why time in nature is healing. And I won't dwell on this, but the World Health Organization is really starting to look at the fact that being well is not just merely the absence of disease, and that also health depends on our ability to manage our interaction between human activities and the physical and biological environment. I think that's so pertinent to what we're talking about here, and that was recognized by the WHO quite a few years back. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some specific examples of studies and the research that is demonstrating that there really are health benefits of time in nature. This is a study that found that when mice were exposed to a bacteria that's found in soil, that they actually were able to navigate a maze twice as fast as the mice that were not exposed to this bacteria. It's called Mycobacterium vaccae, and it was one of those factors in that previous slide of the things that happen. So they were able to navigate a maze much faster. We've seen a number of studies looking at the cognitive or memory type boosts of time in nature. This was one study from a while back looking at kids outdoors and found that the kindergartners who spent time in an outdoor kindergarten actually invented new games 58% of the time, as opposed to those in a more standard indoor kindergarten who invented new games about 16% of the time. And I think you can think of some examples probably in your own life where you've seen that with little kids playing with a stick or rocks or something. This is a famous study from the 1980s looking at hospital stays and found that people who had a room with a view of a tree had much lower requirement for pain medication during their hospital stay. They had fewer negative comments, and they actually had almost an entire day less of their length of stay in the hospital just by being able to see a tree out of their window as opposed to something like an air conditioner. One study found that memory and attention improved by 20% after 1 hour of being outdoors in nature. I always kind of laugh when I share this study that benefit still was found whether the people enjoyed their time in nature or not. Good one to quote to your kids if you're dragging them out with you. Another famous study found that when people spent 90 minutes walking outdoors in nature as opposed to a more built urban setting, that they had less rumination, less of that just kind of cycling of negative thoughts. And that when they put these people in a functional MRI machine, they found that there was decreased activity in a certain part of the brain that was associated with depression, with sadness, withdrawal, and negative self-reflection. So that those areas of the brain lit up less after spending 90 minutes just outdoors in nature. Another study found that when adults chose their own preferred way of being out in nature, that with 20 to 30 minutes doing their preferred activity, they were found to have drops in their stress hormones in their saliva, both salivary cortisol and salivary alpha amylase. So just 20 to 30 minutes in nature will lower your stress hormones. Another study I quote often found that when college students were asked to sit outdoors on this very park bench on campus in a natural setting without access to their cell phones versus controls who sat in a windowless lab, that those who sat on the park bench reported a statistically significant increase in all kinds of positive emotions. And when they increased the duration of time of this study to 15 minutes, there was no added benefit. So just 5 minutes disconnected from your phone out in nature can improve your mood. Another study found that people reported just a general sense of greater health and well-being when they had more outdoor nature contact, with kind of a sweet spot being right around 120 minutes per week. So quick change here. So those are just some of the studies. We'll talk about maybe just a few more. I could go on and on all day about different studies about nature and healing, but I wanted also to talk about what forest bathing is. And Sarah mentioned that we did a virtual forest bathing in the Redwoods a couple of years ago that's still online that you can watch. But forest bathing is a term that is derived from the Japanese term Shinrin-yoku, and it was coined in the early 1980s by a couple of doctors who, similar to the Park RX doctors, were recognizing that their patients in Tokyo were increasingly experiencing mental health difficulties, depression, anxiety, and even suicide rates were starting to rise. And so they wondered if taking people outdoors into nature outside of the city would be beneficial for them physically and mentally. And they found that it was. And so forest bathing is not a hike, it's not a nature identification walk. It's meant to be a slow, mindful, silent walk in nature, just taking nature in through the senses. We use the language of invitation, where if you go out with a forest therapy guide, you will be invited or prompted or offered different ways of taking nature in through the senses. And I'll give a couple of examples of this in a little bit. So this forest bathing, then these doctors started doing experiments on their patients, initially asking them about their mental health experience, and consistently found that after taking people outdoors in nature in this quiet, calm, contemplative, mindful way, that their participants consistently were reporting improvements in mental health. They started looking at other types of physical parameters, found that consistently blood pressure was lowered, heart rate variability, stress hormones and saliva, like some of those other studies that I mentioned. Even blood glucose and blood cholesterol were found to be lowered by just taking nature in this quiet, mindful way. These doctors also studied the chemicals phytoncides that I mentioned earlier, and found that these are in the essential oils of plants, and that when we inhale and take these these fragrances in that you notice when you're in the redwoods, that breathing those in actually can boost our natural killer cells. And natural killer cells are immune system cells that sweep through the body, getting rid of viruses and bacteria and even cancer cells. They found that when their participants in their studies spent 3 days and 2 nights outdoors forest bathing, that the natural killer cells were increased in both number and level of activity, and that this benefit, this increase, lasted for as long as 30 days out from their forest bathing experience. So these are just some photos that I've taken over the years of some forest bathing walks that I've done. You can kind of get a feel for what that might look like. And of course, we can do it in all kinds of settings and all kinds of accessibility. And so we'll segue into trails prescriptions in the Santa Cruz Redwoods. So as you heard, we have launched the Trails RX website and looking at 5 different trails that many of you from the area are probably very familiar with. So we now have started to connect 5 different trails with their health benefits, and also written some forest bathing invitations that one might experiment with while they're out on the trails. So the first one we'll talk about is the Butano Six Bridges Trail. So if you've been there before, you know that this is a heavily forested, beautiful trail, has some elevation change, and so might be a little more strenuous for some people. If you keep going far enough on the trail, you get to a waterfall. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? I'm talking about Castle Rock already. Butano has the redwoods, has 6 different bridges that you're going to cross. There's a location with a bench and even a little bat house that you might stop and see. You can see that in that photo down here. And so some of the trails in this park are a little shorter. And so you might think about that, those studies that I mentioned demonstrating that 30 minutes is a kind of magical time, where 20 to 30 minutes lowered those stress hormones by 20%. There's also been a study that found that being in nature for 30 minutes was found to reduce both depression and blood pressure. So you can imagine yourself sitting on this bench in the 6 trails or 6 bridges trails, gazing at the bat structures, taking in the trees, taking in nature, going for a short hike, and those health benefits that you would gain. Just going to kind of keep moving along here. The next trail in our program is at Henry Cowell, and this is Redwood Grove Loop Trail, which of course also has some magnificent redwoods. So again, if you can imagine that if you spent an hour hiking these trails, I mentioned the study that found 20% improvement in memory and attention span in just 1 hour of time in nature. There was another study that looked at experienced versus inexperienced hikers and found that the experienced ones actually performed better on memory performance tests. So that kind of gives some support to the idea that hiking on a regular basis is really good for your memory. And again, the stress hormones I mentioned before, 20 to 30 minutes or so. So if you can imagine that you were out in Henry Cowell, and this is a photo that I took there on those trails, tree hugging, it really is a thing. So I invite you to do a little virtual forest bathing with me at this time. And you can either close your eyes and imagine this, or gaze at these trees and imagine that you are there physically coming into contact with one of these trees. And so you might wrap your heads around it in an arms around it in an embrace. You might choose to sit with your back against the tree. You might lean against the tree. in whatever way feels comfortable to you, come into physical contact with one of these trees. And as you're doing this, notice the textures of the tree. Notice the temperature of the tree. You might lean your ear against the tree and notice if you hear any sounds within the tree. You might press your face against it. Notice if you feel any movement, any vibrations. Really just notice what you notice through all the senses, tactile, any fragrances. When you get this close to the tree, what do you notice visually going on? And finally, are you surprised by anything that you notice on this tree? And so this might be one way that you could interact with these trails in a mindful, contemplative, sensory way. So we'll move on to another trail. So this one is on the coast, the Año Nuevo State Park and Atkinson Bluff Trail. So this trail has all kinds of features. There are sand dunes, there are plants galore along the trail. You notice the fragrances of the ocean and the sounds of the ocean, the birds and other wildlife there. There's another photo and a bench that you could sit on for contemplation and forest bathing. By the way, forest bathing can happen in any ecosystem, not only forests. We can desert bathe, we can ocean bathe, anything. And so blue-green space, people often will ask, does it matter? Does it matter if it's green space, blue space? And a study looked at research from 18 different countries at both green spaces, inland blue spaces, and also coastal blue spaces, and looked at their effects on mental health. It was very interesting how they layered different kinds of maps and data to get this effect, but they found that visiting all different types of nature scapes was positively associated with overall positive well-being and also with a reduction in mental distress. And they found that the 3 countries with the highest rated well-being were Spain, Portugal, and Bulgaria, and that these places were also, interestingly, associated with the highest number of overall nature visits and the highest number, or the highest amount or prevalence, I guess, of basically nature connectedness, of just feeling connected to nature. We'll move along to Big Basin Park and the Redwood Loop Trail. And those of you who frequent the trails know that Big Basin experienced a significant devastating fire in the year 2020 that burned over 86,000 acres, and that the public was only able to return back in 2022. So as you're walking outdoors in Big Basin around the magnificent redwoods, we can imagine how that could potentially lower our blood pressure, and maybe people have even experienced such a thing. But some studies have linked blood pressure with time in nature. One looked at people who already had high blood pressure and had them spend 7 days and 7 nights. Half of the group spent 7 days and 7 nights out in nature. The other half spent 7 days and 7 nights just in the city, going about their daily lives. And they found that the people who spent 7 days and 7 nights in the forest had significantly decreased blood pressure over their pre-study blood pressure readings, and that was that the people who spent time in the city did not have that benefit. Another study looked at people forest bathing for just 1 day, doing non-strenuous kinds of activities like lying in a hammock, lying on the ground, sitting on a ground, practicing yoga, various things like that out in nature, and found that those people had lower blood pressure than they had for the 5 days prior. And interestingly, that reduction lasted all the way for 30 days out. So you can imagine that as you're strolling around Big Basin among the redwoods, that you're doing your blood pressure some good for that day, but maybe even for longer. And so this is a photo I took there of the trees scarred by fire. Um, it can be painful to look at these trees, but also if you imagine spending 90 minutes, think back to that study I talked about where they noticed less rumination, less of those circulating difficult thoughts, and that when they put them in a functional MRI machine, that they noticed the areas of the brain that dealt with depression and anxiety lit up less. You can even picture that even in this scarred landscape that you might feel better yourself mentally. And so an invitation arose as I was thinking about Big Basin that I titled Finding Life in Death and Decay. So again, if you'd like to join me for this exercise, I would invite you to either gaze upon these trees or perhaps lower your eyes and just imagine yourself in this place. And so often we avert our eyes and we avert our thoughts and mind from the deceased. But what if we instead took a closer look at signs of death and decay in the forest? What if we were to use all of our senses to see, smell, touch if it's safe, and explore such things as deceased insects and animals, forest floor debris, mushrooms, fungi, and plants or leaves with damage? What is happening in these processes? Also, what emotions arise? Is there a message for you in this? And if you have your eyes closed, you may open your eyes and we'll move on to our final trail, Castle Rock State Park and the Castle Rock Falls Trail that I got off on a little earlier. So this is the trail that's a little more strenuous for some people, but look at the beauty of this trail, the rocks, the moss, the redwoods, the vibrant life in this trail. And if you keep going, you will arrive at a waterfall at the end of this trail. An interesting study it was a review of 11 studies actually, and it found that when people exercise outdoor in nature, that they have increased energy, they're more revitalized, they have decreases in overall tension, confusion, anger, and depression, overall greater satisfaction of their experience, and they're more likely to repeat the activity as compared with people who exercised in a gym. So how about that? Just take your regular exercise outdoors to nature and you might be more likely to stick with it and to repeat it and derive all these benefits along the way. When you get to the waterfall at this trail, you'll notice the enormous, vast landscapes. And it's so good for us to look up from our phones and devices to gaze out at a wide landscape. It's excellent as a brain break and for rest for the eyes. There's also interesting research on something called the cathedral effect that has found that when we're indoors in a room with a low ceiling, we're more likely to be able to focus on analytical tasks and more minute kinds of information. But even when they raised the ceiling just a few feet, that people were able to have more abstract thought and increased creativity. So we know that applies to time in nature as well. So if we're outdoors in nature, looking for some inspiration or creativity, studies are finding that it might just happen out there. And for the interest of time, I think I won't go through the final invitation, but next time you're out on a trail that has some moving water or moving anything, a good breeze, ask yourself to take 5 or 10 minutes just noticing what's in motion. And you might find that it's a little more magical than you expect. So we'll stop here. But just to kind of recap, nature, we're just increasingly finding has just so many health benefits, both physical and mental. Health professionals are starting to prescribe nature worldwide, both in the US and in these other countries, as we've seen. There are so many different ways that we can experience nature, both things like hiking and more the physical activity, but also it can be quiet, contemplative time, which could be birding, it could be photography, it could be forest bathing. They all have so many benefits. And also, I think it's important to remember that healing in nature is reciprocal. So, as we're reaping the benefits of nature to our personal health, we're also healing nature right back. So, I will pause there and see if Sarah wants to chat a little bit.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was great. And we are really fortunate to have you advising us in our efforts with this trail program, this trail prescription program. As you alluded to, this isn't your first time doing a program like this. It's not the first time that other people have done it. And I'm curious what you feel like some of the lessons you've learned have been from the time you first started getting
Right.
engaged.
Yeah. Oh, we've learned so much. And I think it's just an evolving process. And every time we do something like this, we can build on it. And obviously, every location is a little bit different. And so that adds to it. One thing that I think is really important is getting health practitioners invested in the healing benefits of nature. And I've found that it's not necessarily only the physicians and the primary care providers or the nurse practitioners, but I have some physical therapists and dietitians who themselves regularly experience the healing benefits of time in nature. And so they have been really good advocates for our program, handing out brochures to their clients and patients. And so I thought initially it would only be the practitioners, the doctors that would be prescribing, but I'm finding that it's the whole village, and it takes a village to really roll something out like this.
And are
Um,
you seeing these programs get traction in terms of not only the number of healthcare providers who are distributing word of this opportunity, but are you seeing people actually getting out and using
Absolutely.
these
Yeah. And
and
I
getting
I have
feedback on that?
I do. I have people reporting back the patients who have decided that this is as important as any of their medication, just as we would feel that improving nutrition is as important as any prescription medication. That they can sometimes kind of multitask. They can get some exercise while they're out there. They can clear their mind. They might get some flash of inspiration that improves their workday. And so I do have a whole slew of patients and reports back that, gosh, this is now my I do this 3 days a week without fail. I get out and I take a lap of this particular trail, and I know that I'm getting these benefits that you tell me
Yeah,
I'm getting,
yeah,
and feel it and I see it.
yeah. This program was designed in connection and in conjunction and in communication with some local park RX programs. In particular, several that are linked to relevant county public health entities in our region. And I wondered if you could speak more about why that was important and how you see these different programs linking and building off of one another.
Well, absolutely. The Park RX movement has really started to get some traction. And
Yeah.
so why not try to collaborate with that and build on that? Um, you know, the trails that we're focusing on here they are within parks, but they might not be what somebody thinks about when they think about going to a park. They might think of a playground, or they might think
Yeah,
of a national park with these enormous, grandiose features. And so absolutely, I think it's important to collaborate, and also perhaps the park RX people will add the trail RX
yeah,
to their prescription.
yeah. That's what I think we're hoping, and
Uh,
I'd love to see it become a model for efforts elsewhere in the state, and
I
beyond, to
would
see that
too.
kind of local state nexus.
Absolutely. I completely agree. That's my hope as well.
Yeah. Um, the whole Parks RX movement, such that it is about prescribing nature. But it seems like it's left really open-ended for patients to sort of choose for themselves what and
Absolutely.
where they go. And I know the Trails RX Guide, Semper Viren's new little program, was developed in part to help people get more information to make informed choices, not only about where they can go, but some of the specific health benefits from some of these specific natural features that you just walked through so nicely. But this idea that we're doing it without sort of telling them where to go specifically, where does that come from? And is there some underlying philosophy around that that we should tell our viewers?
Absolutely. People often ask me if forest bathing is a mindfulness practice because it might seem that it's mindful. We're trying to notice what we notice, which is what mindfulness is all about. But in mindfulness practices, we're taught not to attach emotion to the experience.
Yeah,
Whereas forest bathing, it's all about celebrating the awe and wonder of nature. And so that's why I think it's really important not to get too caught up in the details of you must do this, you must walk
yeah,
8 steps on this trail and then turn right and get your heart rate up to this number and do this and do that. No, absolutely not. It should be a choose your own adventure, discover your own adventure,
yeah,
just completely lost in the moment with the curiosity of a child and see what happens. And that's where the healing occurs, and that's where the magic happens, is just getting out there and seeing what happens without a preconceived notion of what's going to happen. Those are my best nature experiences where I don't have a
yeah,
plan, especially if I'm kind of in a mood of like, nothing to see, nothing to do.
yeah,
And all of a sudden it's nature opens up and you have this incredible experience. So I think it's really important also that people understand there's no wrong way to do it. Whatever you're doing that feels right for you. That one study that looked at the 36 individuals who chose their own nature experience, that was really intentional, so that it was what is important for those people, not what we're telling them to do.
yeah, yeah. What are you seeing as you look at some of the programs you've been involved with, and or as you think about Semper Viren's Trails RX program? What are you seeing as the barriers to entry for folks who are prescribed something like this, but then, you know,
Yeah,
it's not as clear cut as go to the local pharmacy and pick up XYZ medicine and take it 3 times a day.
yeah.
So what helps people make it happen, and what are some of the barriers keeping
This is
people?
something we talk a lot about in
Yeah,
the various organizations I work with, are the barriers. Naturally, we want people to feel safe on trails. And
yeah,
so we recommend the buddy system, certainly. If you choose to hike alone, of course, it's a good idea to share your itinerary, share your route, share your plans with somebody else. Always take water, take a snack, take a first aid kit, know your route, know your plan. So, safety, of course, is something that for some people could be a barrier. Accessibility certainly can be a barrier if people are wheelchair users and things that could make it more difficult to use a dirt trail. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's fantastic that the trails that we chose had various levels of accessibility. So there's
yeah,
something for everyone. Um, Yeah, I think this is the direction that a lot of the organizations and a lot of um, policymakers, influencers even are really trying to look at how do we make time in nature accessible and equitable to everyone. And I know you at Semper Virens Fund spend a lot of time thinking about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like about your talk
Right,
is
sorry, guys.
you point out that even looking at an image of a tree, or if you're in the hospital looking out the window at some vegetation, is a way to connect with nature. It doesn't have to be, rafting the Grand Canyon on a once in a lifetime
Mm-hmm.
$50,000 trip or whatever. The parks that we've highlighted are a bit more remote. They're not just walk out your door for most people.
Hmm.
Walk out your door and you're there. And so I do wonder about that, and think about, well, okay, in some ways state parks are for everyone, and they're more affordable than probably many activities, say, a family could choose to do, but these parks and many state parks require a car and the ability to have, enough time to get to these more remote locations. So
Right.
it's something, as we look forward with this Trails Arts program, I think it's something we're really thinking about is, are there additional places that are closer to communities that we might want to look at? And B, are there things that we could be doing as an organization at a policy level to help make these places more accessible to more people?
By all means. And I think it's interesting. There's this idea of a nature pyramid, and we may have talked about this at one of our other webinars, but this idea that if people can start to think about nature in maybe every day, they try to spend some time just noticing nature in their neighborhood or outside their window at work, or take a walk around the block at lunchtime and notice the street trees or the planted gardens or things like that. That would be like your daily nature exposure.
Yeah,
Maybe once a week you can get to a city park. Maybe once a month or a couple times a month you can get out to a trail, such as these trails if they're
yeah,
close enough. Maybe once a year you make a trek to a national park, and so that you start to think about your nature pyramid like we think about our food pyramids, so that we're
yeah,
getting little doses and different types of doses throughout the year.
yeah. I love that image, and that concept. Are you feeling optimistic about, how these concepts are being received and how they're being adopted? Are you seeing, especially here in this country, are you seeing examples where policymakers are starting to really embrace this?
Well, yes. I'm always optimistic. I think um there's a lot we could be concerned about when it comes to policy and politics and things. Um, I do think that there's an uprising of a sense that we absolutely have to protect these spaces. And as I mentioned before, when we heal in nature, we in turn heal nature. It's impossible to derive benefit from being out in nature and then not feel compelled to protect it. And so that reciprocal relationship just happens automatically. And I think there's no wrong way to experience nature. Well, there are a few wrong ways to experience nature. But for the most part, I think people are well intentioned. And the more we can open people's minds and eyes and awareness to the reciprocal benefits, then I think that's overall a very positive thing. And I'm all about, there are people in Washington, D.C. who are literally getting our lawmakers out forest bathing, and I'm friends with those people. And that makes me really happy.
Yeah, that's great. And they have lovely spaces in Washington, DC to get out
Exactly.
to.
Right.
Well,
So
that concept of reciprocity and protect the land and it will protect you is very much something we hear over and over again from our Indigenous partners. Not only are Indigenous, but they are particularly strong in those concepts. And really, I think it's forming a very core directive that Sempervirens Fund is increasingly following, this awareness and talking very explicitly about the idea that the fate of these forests is directly tied to our fate, and it isn't just something that's nice to have.
Right.
And these forests inspire us, and so therefore we should protect them, but really a very deep core understanding that whether or not these forests and other, other parts of the ecosystem in the Santa Cruz Mountains, whether they survive and thrive is really directly tied to whether the communities, the surrounding communities of the Santa Cruz Mountains similarly thrive. So it's really been not that we didn't understand that concept before, but it's really imbued where we're heading as an organization. And I see the forest health component as just being a logical part and parcel of that. So, well, we are running out of time, and we didn't take any Q&A from our audience, but if we have some key questions, we will try to follow up via email to some of the participants. I want to thank you, Suzanne. You've been amazing as a thought partner to us and advisor to us on these wellness and park prescription ideas. We would not be doing a trail prescription program, but for your influence and guidance. So deep gratitude to you, and we'll look forward to continuing these discussions. For our audience, thank you for joining us. And next month, we are going to be having a really interesting discussion with some folks from Latino Outdoors, their executive director, Luis Villa, and their board chair, Claudia Pineda Tibbs. And we'll be talking specifically about their efforts to get their community and the Latino community writ large, connected more deeply with nature. So it really is a nice segue from this discussion. So again, Suzanne, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience. And a last shout out to Scharf Investments for sponsoring this Under the Redwoods webinar series this calendar year. So thank you all, and we'll see you next month.